May 19th, 1977. RAF Mildenhall, England. Two men are sitting in a mission planning room, looking at coordinates that shouldn't exist. Major Tom Allison and his reconnaissance systems officer, J.T. Vita, are 12 hours from the first operational SR-71 mission ever flown out of England. The target is Murmansk, on the Soviet Union's Barents Sea coast, a submarine base the U.S. Navy has been trying to get eyes on for years. The plan is simple on paper. Fly to the edge of Soviet airspace, turn, run the coastline, come home. Stay outside the line the whole time. Then, someone hands them a piece of paper. The Soviet military has filed a notice to airmen, a routine international courtesy, the kind militaries file so nobody flies into a live fire zone by accident. This one announces a missile test, up to an altitude of 100,000 feet. And when the mission planners plot the coordinates, the box lands exactly where the SR-71 is supposed to fly. Twice.
Phones start ringing between Mildenhall and Strategic Air Command back in Omaha. Someone even patches in Kelly Johnson, the man who designed the aircraft they're about to fly. And Johnson's answer is blunt. Don't fly it. Nobody can prove the timing is a coincidence, and nobody can prove it isn't. The mission goes anyway. The next day, Allison and Vita are strapped into an aircraft climbing toward Mach 3 over the Barents Sea, and the flight almost doesn't go the way anyone planned. The air is hotter than the charts predicted, the jet is climbing slower than it should, and a radar warning sensor lights up earlier than either of them has ever seen it fire. For a moment, they have to decide whether to turn back. They don't.
45 minutes later, they're clear. They've flown directly through the box the Soviets marked out, twice, and picked up the first recorded radio signals from a brand new missile system the U.S. barely understood yet. Signals that will let American analysts identify exactly what the Soviets are building months before it ever shows up outside their own borders. Nothing was fired. Nothing could be fired in time. Allison's own summary of the flight, typed up afterward, doesn't read like a war story. It reads like a shrug. Just another day at the office. That sentence says it all. Not bravado. Arithmetic. This is the SR-71 Blackbird. In 26 years of flying over some of the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, it never carried a single weapon. No gun, no missile, nothing to fire back with. And nobody ever caught it. So what was actually keeping it alive up there?
March 1979. Somewhere over the Atlantic, at 75,000 feet, Major Buzz Carpenter is trying not to think about how sick he feels. He and his RSO, John Murphy, are 3 hours into a mission nobody wanted delayed. South Yemen has just invaded North Yemen. Saudi Arabia is asking Washington for eyes on the border, and the National Security Council needs answers before the crisis moves any further. Carpenter had a bad seafood dinner the night before launch, and somewhere over the mid-ocean tanker track, it catches up with him completely. Sick inside a pressurized flight suit, 9 hours still ahead of him, no way to stop, and no one to tell except the man in the back seat. He decides to keep flying. Scrubbing a presidential priority mission over an upset stomach isn't something either man wants to explain afterward.
This is the part of the story people don't usually get. How strange it is, physically, to survive at the edge of the atmosphere. A pressure suit that dehydrates a man every minute he wears it. Tube food and rationed water for hours at a stretch. By the time they land, Carpenter will have lost 8 pounds. And not only from being sick. None of that is why the mission actually works, though. As they cross into the Mediterranean and push toward Mach 3, the airplane stops behaving like anything most pilots would recognize as a jet. At that speed, movable cones inside each engine intake, called spikes, have already slid backward, reshaping the airflow so radically that the engine itself is barely doing the work anymore. Something close to 80% of the thrust pushing the aircraft forward isn't coming from the compressor blades at all. It's coming from the shape of the air, funneled by the inlet cone on the way in, then accelerated again by the ejector nozzle on the way out. The same basic principle as a ramjet. At cruise, the J-58 turbine is almost along for the ride.
There's no time to admire any of that from the cockpit either. Over the Yemeni-Saudi border, Carpenter starts a banking turn to sweep back across the objective, and the autopilot tries to turn the wrong way. He disconnects it by hand and wrestles the jet back onto the correct heading himself at Mach 3, while Murphy works the sensors and checks they haven't drifted off the invisible line separating international airspace from Yemeni territory. Neither man says more than he has to. At this speed, a wasted word is a wasted half-second, and a wasted half-second is real distance across the ground.
The turn only costs them a few seconds, but the airplane doesn't shrug it off the way the men do. Below the cockpit, the friction of Mach 3 is heating the aircraft's skin past 600 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough that the titanium panels are deliberately built with seams that don't seal tight until the whole airframe expands into shape at temperature. It's why every SR-71 sitting cold in a hangar looks like it's leaking fuel from every joint. On the ground, it simply hasn't grown into itself yet. Coming home, one engine refuses to relight. JP-7 doesn't ignite on its own. It needs a shot of a chemical called triethylborane to catch. The first shot fails. The second one works, and they keep climbing. They land in the rain at Mildenhall, 9 hours after takeoff, the nose gear briefly refusing to lower. Carpenter down 8 pounds and smelling bad enough that he warns the ground crew to keep their distance. Waiting at the foot of the ladder is the wing's deputy commander, holding a tie tack painted brown, with a certificate declaring Carpenter the first. The wording is exact. Surely not true, but funny. Supersonic bowel movement in Air Force history. It gets a laugh across the flight line. It also gets him a beer, which after 9 hours sealed inside that suit, is the only medicine that actually matters. The photographs they bring home confirm the true scale of the Yemeni advance within hours, an answer gathered too fast for anyone on the ground to have stopped them from getting it. Nobody fired a shot at them that entire flight either. Not because nobody wanted to, because by the time any radar operator on the ground finished plotting where the aircraft was, it was already somewhere else. Miles further down a track no missile crew had time to solve. That gap, not any weapon bolted to the airframe, was the entire defense. And it held up, whether the men flying it felt heroic, focused, or simply seasick. The Soviets eventually built an airplane whose only purpose was catching one that never intended to fight back. Within a decade of the SR-71 entering service, Soviet designers had turned 2 different aircraft loose on the problem. The MiG-25 Foxbat, originally built for a different Mach 3 threat, but repurposed to the job, and later its far more capable, purpose-built successor, the MiG-31 Foxhound. Both ended up chasing the same aircraft American aircrews themselves called the Habu, a nickname borrowed from a venomous pit viper native to Okinawa, where the jet first deployed operationally. Fitting, since, like the snake, it wasn't aggressive. It was just something you never wanted to be close to, and something that was already gone by the time you reacted. By the mid-1980s, one Soviet fighter regiment, the 174th Guards Fighter Aviation Regiment, based at Monchegorsk, near Murmansk,
was flying MiG-31s specifically against SR-71 flights coming out of England on their Barents Sea reconnaissance runs. One of that regiment's pilots, Major Mikhail Miyagi, would end up flying 14 intercept attempts against the Blackbird between 1984 and 1987. Miyagi's own account of his 8th attempt, on January 31, 1986, is the closest thing that exists to a Soviet verdict on whether the American approach worked. The alert came in at 1100 hours. Miyagi and his weapons officer ran to their jet, strapped in, and were airborne inside 16 minutes. Full afterburner, a climbing turn through the sound barrier at 26,000 feet and up towards 60,000 feet, chasing a radar vector toward the incoming SR-71.
For once, the weather cooperated. At altitude, the air was so clear that Miyagi actually saw the aircraft's contrail, a rare enough event that he wrote it down as one of the highlights of his career. Moments before, a female voice in his headset, one every pilot in the regiment simply called Rita, had called out a single word over the intercom: attack. It was the aircraft's own targeting computer speaking, not a person, but Miyagi still remembers hearing it. He passed underneath the Blackbird, roughly 2.5 miles below it, close enough to make out its black silhouette against the sky. And then he did the only thing the intercept geometry allowed him to do. He broke off. By his own account, the MiG-31, with a faster missile, a better radar, and a purpose-built mission, kept climbing toward the same ceiling on every attempt, somewhere around 63,000 feet, the rough limit of how high the jet and its missile could reach before running out of room to close the gap any further. Not because the pilots were bad, because that ceiling was what the physics allowed, and no Soviet fighter of that decade could push past it. Miyagi himself put it simply: if the SR-71 had ever crossed into Soviet airspace, a shot would have been fired, and there would have been little the aircraft could do about it. But in the years he flew against it, the SR-71 never crossed that line. It flew close enough to tickle the border, in his words, and no closer. The Soviets were not chasing a myth. They built real aircraft, trained real pilots, and threw a serious air defense network at the problem. And the honest answer, from the men doing the intercepting, was that the numbers never worked. The SR-71's designers hadn't outfought the Soviet Air Force. They'd out-arithmeticked it, years in advance, from a drafting table in California. By April 1986, that arithmetic was about to be tested for something much higher stakes than a Cold War chess match. It was about to be tested with the President of the United States waiting on the answer. A bombing had killed a Turkish civilian and 2 American servicemen in a Berlin nightclub, and U.S. intelligence had tied it to Libya. President Reagan ordered a retaliatory strike, Operation El Dorado Canyon, against military targets in Tripoli and Benghazi. The plan called for Air Force F-111 fighter bombers and Navy strike aircraft to hit the targets before dawn. But a strike is only half a plan. Somebody had to fly over the wreckage afterward, in daylight, and prove what had actually been destroyed. Because if the answer was wrong, the White House would have to decide whether to send pilots back in for a second, riskier pass. That job went to the SR-71 detachment at Mildenhall. And almost immediately, the mission ran into a wall, inside a room, not over Libya. 2 days before launch, the mission planners were called up to brief the Commander-in-Chief of Strategic Air Command directly. They laid the flight track on his desk. 2 large rings on the map showed the coverage zones of Soviet-built SA-5 missile batteries the Libyans had bought, one at Sirte,
one at Tripoli, both of them sitting squarely across the SR-71's planned route. The general's finger landed on the rings. Will these be taken out before the SR-71 goes in?
The mission planner in the room, a major answering to a 4-star general, told him the truth. There was no way to know for certain until the jet was already back and the film was developed. The general wasn't satisfied. I don't want the aeroplane penetrating those SAMs unless we know they've been neutralized. The planner tried to explain that the SR-71's speed and altitude were themselves the safety margin. The general cut him off. I'm not going to risk one of my SR-71s for this piddly little operation.
For a moment, the mission that had already survived a Cold War stare-down over Murmansk and a sick pilot over Yemen looked like it might die in a briefing room in Nebraska. Grounded not by the Soviets, not by the Libyans, but by a general who didn't trust the math. It took less than 48 hours to find a way through that wasn't really a compromise at all. The mission would fly the original route at the original speed and trust the same math that had worked against every SAM site the aircraft had ever flown near. It just needed cover to say so on paper. At 0500 hours on April 15th, Lieutenant Colonel Jerry Glasser and his RSO, Major Ron Tabor, lit both afterburners down Mildenhall's runway, carrying 10,000 pounds more fuel than normal. They refueled twice over the Atlantic, ran the Straits of Gibraltar, and turned toward Benghazi. Glasser leveled off at 75,000 feet, cruising at Mach 3.15. The defensive warning system lit up as they passed Sirte, exactly where the SA-5 battery sat. Nothing followed. As Glasser put it afterward, at that speed, we truly felt invincible. Weather over Tripoli was poor on that first pass, and again on the second attempt the next day. A sensor failure on one jet, cloud and sandstorm obscuring the target on the backup. As Glasser brought the jet down through the rain toward Mildenhall after that first run, an air traffic controller's voice came over the radio, dry and understated in the way only English air traffic control ever manages. "Good morning, gentlemen. It's been a long day for you." Glasser still remembers the lift it gave him, coming down off 9 hours and 3 refuelings, with nothing certain yet about whether the mission had actually worked. It took a third mission on April 17th, flown by Lieutenant Colonels Bernie Smith and Denny Whalen, before the skies finally cleared and the cameras got what Washington needed. Proof, in daylight, of exactly what had and hadn't been destroyed. No second strike was ordered. The math the general hadn't wanted to trust had held. 3 times in 3 days, over the same contested airspace the briefing room had been so afraid of. Go back to that room at Mildenhall in May 1977. Kelly Johnson on a secure line, telling a mission planning cell not to fly into a box the Soviets had marked out on a map. Then look at Tripoli, 9 years later, a different general asking the same underlying question in a different room. Can this airplane survive what's waiting for it? Both times, the answer came from the same place. Not from a gun the aircraft never carried. Not from luck. From an inlet spike sliding backward at the right moment. From titanium built to grow into its own shape at speed. From a decision made years earlier by engineers who understood that the fastest way to survive a fight is to make sure you're never actually in it. In 26 years of operational flying, over some of the most heavily defended airspace on Earth, not one SR-71 was ever shot down by enemy action. Nearly 4,000 missiles were fired at it over the years, across multiple wars and multiple continents, and every single one arrived at a point in the sky the aircraft had already left. The Blackbird was retired in 1990, not because an enemy finally caught up to it. No enemy ever did. It was grounded by budget lines and by satellites that could do the job without a human being strapped to the edge of the atmosphere. Tom Allison's line about the Murmansk mission still heats up as the best description anyone ever gave of what the SR-71 actually was. Not a fortress, not a fighter. A very carefully engineered argument that by the time you finish aiming, the target has already made the argument moot. Just another day at the office, because the airplane made sure it always would be.